This is a proposal. There's some background necessary to explain that proposal. But what this is about, essentially, is a suggestion for a collaborative effort here in Western Australia. Now, the first thing I would observe is that data about individual behaviour collected together is of tremendous use to economists, agricultural economists, absolutely no exception to that. A great deal of useful policy can be determined by how people react, what their preferences are, for example, their time preferences, their attitudes, their decision-making, their priorities, and so on. But the way that the academic world in particular is set up, and I'm thinking of publication in particular, but it's not just that, it's also about research grants and so on, is that most of the work that is done in order to generate these kinds of analyses is cross-sectional. As the slide says, it reviews a particular population or sample at a particular point in time. So in the case of my particular personal interest in terms of decision-making, which is discounting the rate at which people trade present for future values, although there are many other examples that you could cite, that's my particular interest. What tends to happen is that a sample, often students, because they're easy to find and put together in one place, are assembled and a series of tests are given to the sample, and a distribution curve and an analysis is built up from the reactions of that group over time. Now, those of us who are of a left-wing persuasion, and many others too, are probably quite sceptical about whether such a procedure is unideological in an Althusserian sense. The basic fact is, of course, as everyone really recognises, and psychologists have certainly demonstrated, personalities change over time. Individuals move from being students into having jobs and so on, have families. The trajectory of a personality over time, their biography, to use the expression of the French philosopher Lucien Sèvres, is an established phenomenon in psychological research. So there's a mismatch between what we know happens to people over time, which is that they change in response to external stimuli, in response to the evolution of their work, and so on, and the way that academic research is generally conducted, which sort of assumes either that we're not going to be interested in the way that people change, or that we've picked a reasonable distribution of people, which picking a group of students certainly wouldn't do, or that we can somehow go back and revisit the problem later. Longitudinal studies, on the other hand, are exactly designed to analyse the passage of time. If we were to look at, for example, discounting, at the way that people trade the present for the future, we can go ask individuals these questions, and then we can go back and asking the same question later on. Now, there are two different approaches that we can take to this. One is we can look at the same cohort of people and trace through the way that their attitudes and their decision-making and their preferences and so on change over time as they themselves age. That's one possibility. The second thing we can do is look at a given group of people, whether we are looking at, say, students at the University of Western Australia studying agriculture, or we're looking at the population of a town, or anything of this type, and see how the reaction, the responses, the attitudes and the preferences change of that given group when the individuals in it change over time. So two different longitudinal approaches that we can potentially adopt. And certainly, whichever way we do it, longitudinal analysis will permit the measurement of differences or change in the variables that we're interested in, for example, discount rates, from one period to another, how things change over time. And this is very useful because we can look at social phenomena, we can look at the correlation between events that are widely separated in time. We have some real reference work that we can get this. And we can, it doesn't have to be people, of course. We could look at animals, we can look at crops, anything over time. But it's one of the impacts that thinking about things historically, thinking about things biographically, means that we're going to be focused on trying to pay attention to how things change over time rather than how they appear at a discrete point in time. Now, there are plenty of different methods that we can look at in terms of how to do longitudinal studies. We have to identify a sample, a panel. We can link these over time. We can go back and try and do retrospective studies, although it's very difficult to get groups to understand and be able to predict, be able to state accurately exactly how they would have behaved in the past. A lot of the studies that have been done longitudinally concern health issues. So, for example, the number of people who smoke, attitudes towards exercise, frequency of visit to the doctor, prevalence of certain types of diseases and causes of those diseases, and so forth. A lot of these studies that have been done longitudinally have concerned health. Now, in terms of gathering the data, there are a wide variety of different methods that can be used to obtain this data, and I've noted most of them here. And the Australian Institute of Family Studies has been in the lead in terms of looking at families over time, changing cohort studies. There's also a wide variety of questionnaires which have been designed. Individuals have conducted extensive face-to-face interviewing. These, of course, are the same kinds of research methodologies that would be used for cross-sectional studies. The difference here is that if we're trying to make sure that we capture the same information over a period of time, we have to design our questionnaires, design our data collection methods to be reproducible in subsequent time periods, which may not necessarily be very easy. There's also a question of commitment of resources to these kinds of studies. Clearly, and this fits in again with the ideological difference between longitudinal and latitudinal studies, whereas latitudinal studies are ideally suited to individual work and deliver a return in terms of the publication and the prestige, if you like, of having conducted such a survey for an individual or a team at a particular point in time. Longitudinal studies are more like an investment process. They require a collective mentality in order to be able to start them, commit to them, and get rewards from them. Because the fact is that the people who make the investment in the study at the start are very unlikely to be the people who get the returns from the study longitudinally over time, because the study really starts to generate value over a prolonged period of time. Clearly, any of these studies, the more effort that you put in, there's a lot of assembly, a lot of resources, a lot of commitment that needs to go there, and what you put in, eventually you get out. It isn't perhaps surprising that there are relatively few of these extensive longitudinal studies, not least because institutions change, priorities within those institutions change, and in some cases these studies end up getting abandoned, which of course is a great shame in many cases because data series end up stopping and so forth. There are some pretty spectacular examples in Australia. Here's a very good example, which is easy to have a look at. This one is the Building a New Life in Australia, longitudinal study of humanitarian migrants. Now, this was based on a government priority, government policy priority, that the behaviour of migrants to Australia over time was something the government wanted to track. So in terms of employment, in terms of income, in certain cultural variables, and leading to an understanding, not just a snapshot, but an understanding of the process whereby migrants, after they arrived, fitted into, broadly, and benefited from the experience of coming to Australia. And this was done on the basis of a questionnaire. Obviously, a substantial quantity of translation was required, particularly, obviously, in the early stages of interviewing migrants before they necessarily had greater English skills. But it was important from the study's point of view to pick up the personal backgrounds, so where people had come from, so that the longitudinal study could differentiate migrants from different locations in the world, different socioeconomic backgrounds. They also wanted to pick up the migration pathways, so different people coming under different circumstances, even down to different types of visa, what happened to people with a certain class of visa as opposed to another class of visa. You can see, obviously, the policy implications of doing this. Housing questions, how people obtained housing, what sorts of housing they obtained. How people picked up language skills. What jobs they got, of course, what education they went on to receive. Socio-demographical issues such as when they got married, children in Australia, relatives, connections with other migrants, family bonds, and so forth, all connected. And the policy implications of this, clearly, were to try and obtain information which would help determine the best way to assist migrants when they arrived in Australia, and to some extent, quite possibly also, to establish some criteria for decision-making about what sorts of visas should be granted and what sorts of migrants should be encouraged to come here. Now that's quite a considerable government effort. And the institutions that are lying around, which are able to make this kind of commitment towards an organisational approach like this, is relatively rare. Quite remarkably, however, right on our doorsteps here in Western Australia, we have an amazing example of exactly the kind of longitudinal study that I've been talking about here, and with specific reference to health. Now, I'm not sure that when the original health study was set up way back in 1966, there was any expectation that it would in fact carry on for quite such a long time, or that it would be so fruitful in terms of generating research, information, and data. Nor do I necessarily think that those people who put the original questions together for the Busselton Health Study would necessarily have understood all the changes that would be taking place in terms of health queries over the years. But it has been an extraordinarily successful and data-rich environment as a result of that success that has been undertaken in Busselton, and as the slide says, internationally recognised, one of the longest-running population health research programmes of its kind. Thousands of people have been interviewed over the past 50 years. And I think it's immediately obvious to us what the potential areas of research would be, and by extension, the sorts of questions that people would be asked. So everything from sleep disorders to diabetes to genetic influences over time, heart disease, a whole range of different health issues, including environmental and social issues affecting health, have been recorded through the Busselton study. And you can see the website of that study there. There are data sets that can be easily downloaded from that health study. As you can see, hundreds of questions have been asked. Not all those questions will continue to be relevant. Health environment has changed. New questions need to be added in. Sometimes questions get dropped. There's also a question about the regularity of the survey, not always carried out exactly at relevant intervals, so it's not entirely possible to be completely accurate about the rate of change. But the survey has expanded to make biological specimens available, And in terms of the influence of policy on health in a region like this, the study has proved immensely useful to work out what people's individual preferences are and what the impact of policies have been on those individuals and that individual location. Now, you could put some potential criticisms. You could say that there may be some local issues associated with Busselton, which mean that the information is not generalizable. That's one potential criticism of any longitudinal study. You could also say that migration into Busselton and changes in the composition of the population that occur as a result mean that there may be problems with using longitudinal data to derive any more general conclusions, particularly if there have been other major policy shifts which have also had an influence on what the data tell us. These are limitations of any longitudinal study. We know that there will be policy changes, maybe even in response to the longitudinal studies. We know that prices of goods, relative prices of goods will change. We know that technology will come along and distort and change buying patterns. We know that consumer behavior will change. We know that health behavior will change. We know that different drugs are going to be available. All of those things will make a longitudinal study, will influence a longitudinal study of health. There's going to be limitations in any such longitudinal study as a direct result of that. But the general view of international researchers is that the Busselton example has been immensely positive. And it's certainly an example of a successful survey which we have locally and could form the basis for learning from in order to do something equivalent in a different area. Here's another extremely well-known international example of a longitudinal study, possibly the most famous example of a longitudinal study. And it's really interesting to me that the original motivation behind this television series, which is a series of films produced every 7 years on children growing up, absolutely gripping viewing. If you can see it, the programs are available on YouTube, and you can go and see them. They interviewed a group of 7-year-old children when they started, 1964, and then every 7 years they went back and interviewed the same children about their views, and as they became adults and so forth, their experiences of life, what they'd done, and what their views were at any given point. 1 or 2 people dropped out. Most have actually stayed. And it has been almost universally lauded as a fabulous documentary series. Again, absolutely gripping television. And one of the most interesting things about this, and it's a measure of the way that societies worldwide have changed, is that when the selection criteria were originally made for the children for 7-Up, the explicit interest in this was from which social class they came. And the assumption that underlay this was that social class would be a dominant determining factor in what happened to the individuals in their subsequent lives. Now, you can watch the programme, come to your own conclusions about whether that was a reasonable assumption. And ABC is now doing the same thing in Australia. And similarly, one can come to some conclusions about whether social class exists in the same way as it did then, and about whether social class, in whatever way it exists, helps determine people's future and people's priorities. But this example is a highly public, very well known, and extremely interesting, but of course quite different approach to the Busselton data inquiry and questionnaire approach. Similarly longitudinal, but of course much more oriented towards entertainment and social poise, if you like, rather than the gathering of data. The point I would make, though, is that the number of surveys like this is very, very few. By comparison, of course, to the vast majority of data collection or entertainment, which is, in a sense, cross-sectional. Hence we come to the idea of the proposal. Now, I have the good fortune to have lived for 10 years in a shire not too far from the centre of Perth. It's about 130 kilometres east of Perth. And we have a very large area, as you can see, almost 2,400 square kilometres. And we have a population of just 1,700. Now, in the Shire, we have three predominant groups of people and families. We have farming families. It's predominantly agricultural area. It's part of the wheat belt, of course, and a very profitable area of the wheat belt in recent years, with good harvests and reasonably acceptable rainfall. We have some farming families, several of which have been in the Shire for over 3, 4, in some cases I think up to 5 generations. They form quite a tight-knit and relatively homogeneous community with clear preferences in terms of their activities and their attitudes. The second group of people to whom I belong are smallholders. Over the past 20, 30 years, particularly perhaps during the 1980s, 1990s and 2000s, the process has somewhat attenuated since then. There have been a number of subdivisions of farms where farms have not passed to succeeding generations and been sold up. And the result of that is that we've had the development, some of them long historical small blocks, others newly created small blocks of roughly 40 hectares or thereabouts, depending on the minimum allocated size in different parts of the Shire. So these smallholders form another culturally much less homogeneous, socially less homogeneous group. Some of them are permanent residents there like me, others are weekenders who come to their blocks for whatever purpose, recreation mainly, not so much farming, but mainly recreation purposes. Finally, there's the town itself, which contains just over 1/3 or so of the people of the Shire, and these people obviously living within a relatively small geographical area, and they form another relatively heterogeneous group themselves. Now, my proposal, my idea, is to take this Shire and start the process of building an equivalent to the Busselton Health Study. Now, if we did this, we'd have to think about how frequently we would want to do it, and my suggestion would be about 5 years. But to try to learn from the experience of the Busselton questionnaire and process and do it regularly at 5-year intervals. It's the second type of survey that I'm suggesting. So I'm looking at I want to look at the evolution of the Shire. So not tracking the individuals and how they behaved and how their attitudes change, but looking at Beverley itself and how it changes. In terms of the composition, I'm particularly interested in the relationship between the different component elements of the Shire and what their attitudes are and what their priorities are. From an agricultural point of view, obviously, the farmers' attitudes will be most important. So decisions about cropping, decisions about the split between crops and animals, decisions about investment, From my perspective, discount rates would be particularly interesting to see what the discount rate process would actually be and how it might change over time, and what the relationship between individual discount rates and macroeconomic considerations or crop prices or otherwise would be. That would be extremely interesting. Once we've got the data from the questionnaire process administered in Beverley over time, we can easily correlate that with data that's changing over time, such as average crop prices, interest rates, even exchange rates, economic development, population of the Shire, general population in Western Australia, questions about even about fuel prices and so forth. There's a huge number of potential data series that we can correlate to the data we can get out from the longitudinal survey once we start getting that longitudinal survey. And the remarkable thing, I think, is that there's so few such surveys, whereas we've got the Busselton survey, and even that's relatively unusual. We don't have an agricultural equivalent. So I'm suggesting a sort of twinning process where UWA, and particularly the Agriculture Department, adopts Beverley as the place where it's going to conduct its survey. And from that, we can build a whole series of research projects based on the relationships with the data. And we can hopefully, if we start out right, we get the right questions to start with, we can repeat those questions, although, of course, if things change, then we'll want to ask new questions. If we'd done this 10 years ago, we probably wouldn't be asking people about drones. We're probably going to have to start thinking about asking them about drones now. We certainly would be asking people about electronic farming. I think we'd very much want to know about employment statistics, how many people are being employed on the land. All of this would be extremely interesting and relevant information, and a lot of effort would need to be put into designing the initial questionnaire. Obviously anonymous. The only thing that I would want to get out from this is the categorization of the respondent as to whether they were farmers, whether they were smallholders, or whether they were so-called townies. That's important because otherwise we're not going to get the information out that we need. I think a questionnaire, if it was properly administered, we can see that we're looking at a target of 1,700 people. That's quite a lot, but it's not impossible. You take out the children out of that, you're probably looking at trying to get round to about 1,000 people, which should be able to be done within a reasonable period of time. Obviously, we wouldn't want to let the survey drag on over too long a time, otherwise the inevitable problem of changing of perceptions at the beginning and the end of the actual survey period. So we want some people to come and get that survey done over a period of time. And I think there would be a lot of advantages. I think it would help generate additional skills here within UWA. I think it would increase the reputation of what we do here because we would have a unique longitudinal survey that people would be interested in. Busselton's survey itself has generated a whole lot of academic papers, and I see absolutely no reason why the Beverley survey wouldn't do the same thing. Every reason to suggest it would be able to do that. In addition to that, we're moving into a very interesting time for agriculture and agribusiness in terms of its contribution to the West Australian economy. And everything that we do in terms of the way that the wheat belt operates is, of course, going to be of interest to us. We have to be careful. I recognise that what goes on in Beverley is not necessarily going to be entirely applicable even to other shires within the wheat belt because of different rainfall patterns particularly and different ownership patterns, so that we must be careful about generalising, but that's the same problem with the Busselton study. Of course, though, because the economic future of the wheat belt is important to us, we will be able to use that study as a way of promoting not only what goes on in the wheat belt, but also what's happening within UWA itself. So I think there's a synergistic benefit to be obtained from all of that. In addition to that, of course, it should be great fun. There should be plenty of opportunities for students to come and learn about questionnaires, learn about the way that we accumulate data, understand the importance of gaining data actually on the front line at the primary data collection, rather than just manipulating secondary data. This will also lead people to understand the sorts of problems that are involved with the collection of primary data, which in my experience a lot of students, and for that matter many of the graduates and professionals that I teach in my normal activities are not necessarily aware of. Bias and sample selection and the approaches of interviewing and so forth, all of which would be important and relevant. And I think, finally, the whole thing would be able to be done relatively inexpensively. I don't think the funding would be particularly too difficult in this regard. So my suggestion is that we move on from this. We talk to the people in Busselton and understand what they've done and what their difficulties are and what the benefits of doing so. We find what expressions of interest that we have and where we would need to get support from and put it onto the agenda here in UWA. And we end up with a proposal which can be used for funding support if that's what we choose to do. We can work out how many people we need to be involved in this, over what time frame we would need, what our research methodology is going to be, draw up the draft questionnaires, look at the long-term objectives of the survey, compare it with other longitudinal studies, work through a literature review of other longitudinal surveys and the other issues that have arisen, talk to 7UP as well to find out what some of their experiences are, and then start talking to those people within the department and within UWA who are going to be benefiting from all of this. I think this is likely to be a useful exercise. I think it's worthwhile. I think that from an ideological point of view, it's important to understand the way that areas, shires and groups of people are changing over time. And I think if we leave this as a legacy for future generations inside UWA and elsewhere to see the data and the results of what we do, I think we will have achieved a very useful activity indeed. And for myself, I am particularly interested in seeing whether the discount rates vary between the three different groups that I've identified, and whether those discount rates change over time, and what drives those changes over time. That's my interest. For any one of interest of mine, I'm sure that my colleagues here in the University of Western Australia Agriculture Department and elsewhere will come up with other interests that they too want to see investigated in a longitudinal study. Let's see how far we can select the right subjects and we can drive this project forward. Thanks very much.